For almost 3 months, the millionaire's mother had barely touched her food. 7 doctors had already given up on finding an explanation. As a last resort, he hired a new cook. Within a few weeks, she did the one thing that no one in that house had the courage to do. She brought the millionaire's mother back to the family dining table. Christine tapped her fork against the porcelain and stared at the woman in the apron standing beside the wheelchair.
"Who gave you permission to bring this wheelchair to my table?" she asked, without lowering her voice. No one answered. Grace did not back down, and what happened in the next minute would expose a secret that Christine had been hiding for more than a year. Before we continue, leave a like now, because that dinner was just the beginning, and not even the millionaire could have imagined why his own mother had stopped eating. It had been nearly 3 months since Eleanor, Richard's mother, had stopped eating properly. It wasn't all at once. It happened slowly. A half-finished plate here, a rejected dinner there, until it became a routine. Richard, the owner of a construction firm that had been building properties across the region for over 20 years, had the kind of wealth that could solve almost anything, except this. He had already taken his mother to 7 different doctors in 8 months. None found any illness. The medical reports all looked similar: a condition compatible with old age, possible situational sadness, with a recommendation for monitoring. Christine always had the same ready explanation for anyone who asked. "It's just her age, poor thing. It comes and goes." Richard repeated this to himself so many times that he almost managed to believe it. It was after the 7th doctor left without answers that Richard decided to try something else. A business associate mentioned in passing that he had seen a similar case improve with real food made by someone who cooked with affection, not just out of obligation. That was how Grace entered the Harrington Manor, hired in a hurry in the hope that a different menu could achieve what no medicine had managed so far. She had been working there for just over 3 weeks, too short a time to know every corner of the house, but long enough to feel that something there did not add up. It did not take her long to notice, despite being so new to the house, what none of the 7 doctors had seen in 8 months of consultations. Eleanor did not seem sick. She seemed lonely. Grace would arrive before 5 in the morning, when the house was still asleep, using that silence to learn the kitchen's habits on her own, which pans Martha preferred, where each spice was kept, and how to light the traditional wood-burning stove next to the modern electric cooker, because she had heard that Eleanor loved the smell of burning wood. She did not yet know the family's history or the secrets of that grand manor house, but she had the observant eyes of someone who pays attention to the small details.
Martha, the housekeeper who had worked in that manor for 27 years, shared things gradually between tasks, mentioning that Eleanor had not always been so quiet. In the past, she loved to chat while someone cooked nearby. She had a strong personality and would laugh loudly while telling stories about the country farm where she grew up. Grace could not say exactly what had changed. She only felt, without being able to explain it fully, that the quiet lady,
barely raising her eyes from her plate, was not truly herself deep down. Guided by the little she knew, Grace decided to do things differently that night. She prepared Eleanor's favorite dish, a traditional potato and cabbage mash that she had learned to make by observing the elderly lady during the brief moments she still came down to the kitchen, talking about how her mother used to make it in the countryside. Grace did not ask anyone's permission. She wheeled the wheelchair to the dining room at a time when only Christine was at the table. Richard had not yet returned from work, and Grace served the dish as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That was when Christine tapped her fork against the porcelain and asked, without lowering her voice, who had given the order to bring that wheelchair to her table. No one answered. Grace did not retreat. She finished arranging the plate in front of Eleanor and stood there waiting, staring back at Christine without lowering her eyes for a single second. The elderly lady slowly brought the spoon to her mouth and chewed. Her eyes brightened in a way no one had seen for months. She said softly, looking at her daughter-in-law, "It's been a long time since anyone let me sit here." At that very moment, the dining room door opened. Richard walked in, still in his suit, briefcase in hand, straight from work. He stopped mid-stride, sensing the heavy silence before even understanding the reason. He had arrived too late to comprehend what had truly just occurred there. He saw only the end of a scene that had already been resolved before he crossed the threshold, unaware that those words,
"It's been a long time since anyone let me sit here," carried months of history he knew nothing about.
Christine looked at her husband standing in the doorway, briefcase still in hand, and felt the ground vanish beneath her. There was no way to explain that scene without exposing what she had been doing for months. She merely claimed she had a headache and vanished upstairs, leaving Richard standing there watching his mother eat with an appetite he hadn't seen in months, without understanding why it bothered him so much to see it, as if, deep down, some part of him already suspected he had let something major slip right under his nose. Martha observed everything from the kitchen doorway with the discreet manner only someone who has lived in the house for decades could manage. It was she who, later that night, waited for Grace to finish washing the dishes to strike up a quiet conversation in the service corridor, where no one could overhear. "You don't know what you've got yourself into," Martha said, looking both ways before continuing. "This business with Eleanor didn't start today, and it's no accident." Grace stopped her dishcloth. "What do you mean it's no accident?" Martha shook her head like someone deciding not to reveal everything at once. "Take it easy, just keep your eyes open." She returned to her room without another word, leaving Grace with more questions than she had before.
That night, Grace could not sleep properly. She kept thinking about Eleanor's words. "It's been a long time since anyone let me sit here," and how they sounded less like forgetfulness and more like a deliberate plan. She also thought of her own grandmother, who had raised her alone until she was 14 and died frail and quiet in a rented room, at a time when Grace had neither the money nor the time to sit beside her during meals. That debt had never been settled.
It was the real reason she had stopped what she was doing without a second thought to bring that plate to the table. The next day, when Grace went down to the kitchen before sunrise, as she always did, she found a note on the counter written in Christine's cramped handwriting. "From today onwards, Eleanor's meals will be served in her room without exception." Underneath, a second line was written with more pressure from the pen, as if added later in a moment of anger. "And we have hired a nutritionist to monitor every plate that leaves this kitchen." Grace reread the note twice. It was not just about mealtimes, it was about control. And she had just become a problem for someone who hated losing control of anything.
The nutritionist arrived 2 days later, a stern woman with a clipboard in hand, who measured every spoonful of food that went up to Eleanor's room and noted everything down in a booklet, as if that were more important than the elderly lady eating with pleasure. Grace was no longer allowed to go upstairs. The trays were delivered to the door and collected by a new nurse hired that same week, who only spoke of blood pressure and medication schedules,
never of anything that would make Eleanor smile. One morning, before leaving for work, Richard stopped by his mother's room and found her finishing her breakfast alone, something he hadn't seen in a long time. "You seem to be eating better this week," he remarked rather awkwardly at breakfast, looking at Christine. "Is it my imagination, or is my mother looking different?" Christine did not even look up from her phone. "It's the nutritionist, Richard. I made some adjustments to the menu last week. I told you it would yield results." The answer came quickly, too rehearsed. Richard, satisfied with any explanation that did not demand more of his attention, went back to work without asking anything further. It was not the first time he had accepted the easiest version. He just didn't realize yet that it was becoming a habit.
But Grace had learned as a young girl that rules imposed by people who dislike you always have a loophole somewhere. She began writing short notes in neat handwriting and placing them under the plate. "This one is just how your mother used to make it, Eleanor. I hope it brings back a lovely memory." She never signed them. She didn't need to. The elderly lady knew whom they were from. It was Martha who became the bridge between them.
The housekeeper would go upstairs to tidy the rooms and take the opportunity to tell Eleanor small details. That the cook had asked if she liked traditional milk fudge, that she had searched for the recipe for the strong chicory coffee that her late husband Arthur used to drink every morning before heading out to the fields, and how she wanted to bake her a Victoria sponge cake. Eleanor treasured every detail like someone hiding money away, and gradually, slowly, she began eating more. Not because the nutritionist ordered it, but because someone, even from a distance, still remembered her as a person and not just a patient. Christine was not slow to notice. The lady who previously only pushed her food from side to side was now finishing what was served. This did not align with the weekly reports the nutritionist submitted, which were filled with food refusal and signs of apathy. One night, Christine went upstairs without warning and found one of Grace's notes under the empty plate. She stood there, reading those few lines, with an anger she could not explain even to herself. She did not go and shout at anyone. Christine had learnt in life that people who shout lose control of the situation, and control was the one thing she would never surrender. She went down to the kitchen alone after the entire house had gone to sleep, and found Grace finishing packing away the dinner pans. "I found this today," she said, placing the note on the counter between them. Grace's neat handwriting, exposed under the dim kitchen light, suddenly looked small and fragile next to her employer's cold voice. "Eleanor likes to know who prepared her food," Grace replied without lowering her eyes. "I didn't see any problem with that." "The problem," Christine said, stepping a pace closer, "is that you do not work for my mother-in-law. You work for me. And I did not authorize any notes, any conversation, or any closeness." Her voice remained low, but each word came out slowly, calculated, in the manner of someone who had already decided the outcome before even finishing speaking. "I could dismiss you right now, but I prefer to resolve this my own way, without a scandal, without needing to bother my husband with minor details. You will simply feel the difference." She left the kitchen without waiting for a response, leaving Grace standing there with the note still on the counter, understanding that she had just been warned, not threatened openly, but warned in the way people like Christine warn, without witnesses, without leaving proof, without giving a chance for defense. The difference appeared within a few days, one thing at a time. A new padlock appeared on the pantry, where the spices Grace brought from home were kept, the very ones she used in Eleanor's dishes. A small camera was installed on the kitchen ceiling, officially for stock control, according to the explanation Christine gave to the technician installing it, but the angle pointed directly at the counter where Grace usually wrote the notes. Her start time was changed without prior notice to after Eleanor's breakfast, enough to ensure the two would never cross paths in the kitchen when the tray went up. Grace understood the message without needing any further explanation. She had not been fired, but she was gradually being pushed out, in the exact same way Eleanor had been pushed out for months. The difference was that she could still fight against it, and she decided she would keep trying, only with more caution. In the following days, she felt the weight of that silent surveillance in every gesture. She avoided looking directly at the camera, measured her words whenever anyone entered the kitchen, and hid the notes in a different place each day. It was exhausting to live like that, always calculating the next step, but it was less exhausting than imagining Eleanor returning to eating alone in her previous silence. It was Martha who appeared in the kitchen the next day, her face tense, looking both ways before speaking, just as she always did when she was about to share something important. "What you're feeling now, I've seen it before," she said softly, without going into detail. "It's not the first time she's done this sort of thing in this house. I won't tell you everything now because there are things I'm still piecing together myself, but pay attention to one thing. When Christine decides to handle things alone without taking anything to her husband, it's because she has decided on something big and wants no witnesses." Grace felt a chill run up her spine. "Big in what way?" Martha only shook her head, her eyes darting to the door, as if afraid of being overheard even late at night, with the whole house asleep. "It's not time yet, but stay sharp and don't stop doing what you're doing. Just do it more covertly." The sentence hung in the kitchen air, and Grace understood clearly for the first time that this was not a temporary disagreement between employer and employee. It was a silent struggle for who held control of that house, and Eleanor, without knowing it, was right in the middle. Keeping her distance from Richard's mother, as requested, did not mean giving up. Grace understood she needed to be cleverer, not absent. She continued preparing the dishes with the same care as always, each carrying a piece of the history Martha shared, little by little. The day Eleanor danced at a harvest festival with her husband, the recipe for the Victoria sponge cake her mother used to make on the wood stove, the name of the dog she had when she was a girl.
Each dish became a memory served as food, and Eleanor ate it all, slowly, like someone reliving a piece of her own life with every forkful.
It was on one of those afternoons that Martha mentioned quietly, while helping to dry the dishes, that Violet had called the house again, asking about Eleanor, and that the call, like the others, had not been put through. "She doesn't even know her friend still thinks of her," Martha said, shaking her head, her eyes tired like someone carrying this kind of secret for far too long. "She lives believing she's been forgotten."
That weighed on Grace more than anything else she had heard about the situation.
Still in the kitchen, processing the conversation, she decided she needed to do more than just cook with love. "If I do something and get caught," she said, thinking out loud, "it could be the end of my job here. I've already felt that from Christine this week." Martha nodded slowly. "And if you do nothing, what changes? Eleanor stays just as she is. Another month like this, and I don't know if she'll cope. Sometimes the greatest risk is not taking one." She paused, looking toward the kitchen door. "I'll help you, but with a set time, a proper plan, so we leave no trace behind."
It was that night they decided to take the risk together. Grace secretly prepared a full dinner for Eleanor, and Martha helped wheel her down to the back veranda, away from the main lounge, at a time when Christine always went to the gym. It worked for 2 weeks. Eleanor ate on the veranda beside Martha, the two of them laughing and swapping old stories about her husband's estate and the harvest festivals from decades ago. For the first time in months,
someone in the house saw her laugh genuinely, not just a polite smile. On one of those afternoons, Eleanor even hummed a tune softly while eating, something Martha swore she hadn't seen happen since Arthur had died. But secrets in a grand house rarely last. It was the nutritionist herself, reviewing the weekly weight logs, who noticed a small but real gain and casually mentioned it to Christine, thinking she was delivering good news. Christine did not receive it as good news. She saw it as proof that someone was disobeying her orders behind her back. This time, she didn't go to Richard with vague insinuations. She went straight to the point, but with her usual veneer of concern. "Richard,
"I've found out something you need to know," she said, sitting on his bed that night, her voice low and her face serious. "Your employee is disobeying what the nutritionist determined. She is giving your mother food secretly, outside of medical control. And what's more, your mother mentioned to her about leaving something to those who care for her properly. Doesn't that worry you? A new maid getting so close so quickly to a lady with your mother's wealth." It was the first time Christine had implied there was a financial interest behind Grace's care, and it was calculated. She knew that bringing up money would make Richard more suspicious than anything else. It worked. Richard, who until then had remained neutral, felt a different kind of distrust, the fear that this was all, deep down, about his mother's inheritance. He did try to ask his mother directly the next day, going up to her room before work, determined to resolve the doubt with her own words. But Christine appeared in the doorway seconds later with the excuse that it was time for medication, and the conversation never truly happened. Richard went downstairs, thinking he would have time to ask again later. He didn't. The next day, Richard called Grace into his study, serious and direct, without his previous awkwardness. "I need you to understand one thing," he said. "My mother is under medical care. If you continue to go against this and even let her talk to you about money, I will have to reconsider whether you continue to work here." Grace wanted to explain, wanted to tell him about the veranda, the laughter, the plate Eleanor had finished entirely for the first time in months. She wanted to tell him that the talk about leaving something to those who care properly had been initiated by Eleanor herself without her asking for anything. But she saw in Richard's face that it was not the time. He had already decided to believe another version, and arguing there would only confirm in his eyes that she was the problem Christine described. She left without another word, swallowing the urge to insist.
Because she knew from life experience that there is a right time for every battle, and this was clearly not hers. She walked out of the study with her stomach in knots, knowing she had lost important ground. She was in the kitchen, packing away the pans, when Martha came running in with a haste Grace had never seen in her 27 years of quiet service. "You need to come with me now," Martha said, her voice trembling. "There is something happening upstairs you won't believe." Grace followed Martha up the service stairs, her heart beating faster with every step. They stopped in the upstairs corridor, near the half-open door of the small study Christine used for managing household matters. Inside, two men were talking in low voices with her. One of them Grace recognized as the doctor who had attended Eleanor for years, Dr. Harrison. The other, younger man, held a folder with the name of a private clinic printed on the cover. "The assessment needs to be signed by Thursday morning before he travels," Christine was saying in the same calm voice she used for everything. "Richard travels to London on Thursday to close an important contract and won't be back until Sunday. It's the perfect window." Dr. Harrison seemed uncomfortable, fidgeting with his hands awkwardly. "Christine, I'm not sure about this. I examined Eleanor last week. She is much better than she was 2 months ago. There is no clinical justification for an admission." "It doesn't need to be a permanent admission," Christine replied, without changing her tone. "Assisted respite, a specialized place with proper professional monitoring, not the amateurism of a cook playing doctor. It's for her own good, doctor. She needs care that this house, as it is, can no longer provide." The man from the clinic opened the folder and showed a document. "We just need the signature of the responsible doctor and the space is already reserved. The van will collect her on Friday morning very early, before breakfast, while Mr. Harrington is still in London."
The clinic representative was still speaking about the details of the reserved room, the monthly fees, and the permitted visiting hours, when Martha pulled Grace by the arm, drawing them away from the door before they could be noticed. Grace's hands were shaking, and she had to hold on to the service banister to avoid making a sound as they hurried down the stairs. They went down to the kitchen in silence, and only there, with the door closed, did Grace manage to process what she had just heard.
It was no longer about meal times or cancelled visits. It was about taking Eleanor from her own home, hidden from her own son, using a document signed by a doctor who didn't even fully believe in what he was doing.
"Is this illegal?" Grace asked, still trying to grasp the scale of it. "I don't know if it's illegal,"
Martha replied, sitting on a chair, looking exhausted, as if she had aged 10 years in those last few minutes. "But it is wrong, and she knows it. That's why she chose to do it all in secret the week her husband is away. People who act rightly don't need to wait for someone to leave the house to get things done." It was then that Martha finally told her everything she knew, what she had kept secret for months out of fear of losing her job, fear of getting involved in a fight that wasn't hers. She explained that for over a year, Christine had been gradually isolating Eleanor. First, cancelling visits from old friends with excuses of fatigue, then changing meal times until the elderly lady ate alone early, before anyone else woke up, then replacing the old caregiver, a cheerful woman who laughed and talked, with a nurse who only spoke of medicine and blood pressure. Each small isolated step seemed reasonable. Together they formed a trap. "Why does she do this?" Grace asked, still struggling to understand the reason behind such effort. Martha shrugged, but answered as honestly as she could. "I think she never truly felt like the mistress of this house. She always lived in Eleanor's shadow, even with her being ill and in a wheelchair. As long as her mother-in-law has a voice in this house, Christine feels she rules nothing. Isolating her is the way she found to finally feel in command. The explanation did not justify anything, but it helped Grace understand the scale of what she was facing. It was not mindless cruelty, it was fear disguised as control. And that, she knew from life experience, was the hardest thing to fight, because the person doing it will never admit, even to themselves, what they are doing.
Both stood in silence for a moment, the kitchen clock ticking away the seconds, as if each were worth more than usual. Grace thought of her grandmother, of the feeling of knowing something bad was coming and not arriving in time. She was not going to let that happen again, not this time, not while there was still something she could do. "We need to warn Richard," she said, already thinking of solutions. "Warn him of what?" countered Martha. "That we were eavesdropping behind the door."
He already suspects you. He'll think you're making up stories to defend yourself after yesterday's telling off. And the doctor signing off with the clinic gives a legal appearance to all of this. Grace felt panic rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew from a lifetime of caring for people whom no one else wanted to care for that panic solves nothing. It only clouds your thoughts. She needed a plan, not panic. "When is his trip again, Bennett?" she asked. "On Thursday morning."
"Back only on Sunday."
"And the van comes to collect Eleanor on Friday morning then?"
Martha nodded.
"Very early, before breakfast, I heard the clinic fellow telling Dr. Harrison." "Then I need to speak to Richard before he travels," Grace said, already getting up. "Tomorrow morning, before the luggage goes into the car." Martha held her arm. "Think carefully before you do this. If you go to him saying you overheard things behind closed doors, he won't believe you. He's already on her side in this." "I know it," Grace replied, but staying silent is not an option. If I don't try and things go wrong, I won't be able to live with myself."
On Wednesday, the day before Richard's trip, Grace tried. She waited for him alone in the garage as he loaded his bags into the car and approached with her heart in her mouth. "Mr. Harrington, I need to speak with you about something important before it's too late." He didn't even turn his face properly. "If it's about my mother again, we've already discussed it." "It is about your mother, but not in the way you think." Grace took a deep breath.
"I've learnt that there is a van coming to collect Eleanor on Friday morning, very early, to take her to a clinic while you are away." It was the first time Richard seemed to truly stop and listen, but not in the way she had hoped. His face hardened with a mixture of anger and suspicion. "How do you know about that? Have you been listening to conversations that aren't yours?" "I only want Mrs. Eleanor to be well," Grace tried, but she saw, from the way he clenched his jaw, that she had gone about telling him the wrong way. She should have brought Martha with her. She should have waited for more concrete proof, should have thought about how that would sound coming from someone who had already been accused of interfering too much in the family's life. "This is a medical matter, and it is a family matter," Richard said, with a coldness Grace had never seen in him. "My wife is handling this with our trusted doctor, and you are invading other people's conversations, making up stories about hidden vans. This has gone too far." "I didn't make anything up, Grace insisted, feeling her last chance slipping through her fingers. "You can ask Dr. Harrison yourself, you can call the clinic, you can check before deciding I'm lying." "I am not calling anywhere based on servants' gossip," Richard cut in, his voice rising for the first time. "You've already been warned once to keep your distance. Now you come with this story the day before my trip, trying to set me against my own wife. Enough." He slammed the boot shut. "Tomorrow morning before I leave, you will receive your final pay. You don't need to return after that."
It was that dry, without shouting, that Grace was dismissed, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had tried to warn him in a way that sounded like intrusion to a man who had been convinced weeks before that she was the problem. She walked back to the kitchen with weak legs, feeling the weight of having lost not just her job, but the last chance to prevent this from within the house. Christine, who watched the scene hidden behind the living room curtain, felt a wave of relief that almost made her smile.
She had won, not because she had proved anything, but because she had succeeded, with months of patience, in making her own husband distrust the cook more than his wife. The next morning, Richard set off as planned without saying goodbye to anyone but his wife and daughter, still too irritated to think twice about the conversation in the garage. Christine watched the car disappear down the driveway, standing at the gate with her arms crossed, and only went back inside when the engine noise could no longer be heard, filled with a calm that only made things worse. She called the nurse, confirmed with Dr. Harrison over the phone, and reviewed the clinic paperwork for the third time, which was already signed and ready since the previous evening. She locked everything in a folder in her study drawer and spent the rest of the day attending to the normal household chores, as if nothing different were to happen the next day.
Eleanor, knowing nothing, felt the silence of the house change that day. There was no smell of food coming from the kitchen at the usual time. There was no sound of pots clattering, nor any notes under her plate. The new nurse, who temporarily took Grace's place in the kitchen, only knew how to heat up processed soup without seasoning, without any story behind it. The elderly lady ate only a few spoonfuls and pushed her plate away, returning to the same silence of months ago.
As if her body felt, before even knowing why, that something bad was approaching, she spent the rest of the afternoon staring out of the window, barely speaking, just as she used to do before Grace arrived. Grace, on the other side of town, in the small terraced house where she had lived, alone since her grandmother died, tried to come to terms with what had happened. She counted her final pay on the kitchen table, thinking of how that amount did not even begin to cover what she felt she had lost. Not the job, but the chance to finish what she had started. She remembered her grandmother, the rented room, the same feeling of helplessness at watching someone fade away without being able to do anything in time. History seemed to be repeating itself, and this time she wasn't even inside the house to try and stop it. She called Martha twice that afternoon just to get news, and both times she heard almost the same thing. Eleanor had barely touched her plate, her room was quieter than ever, and Christine was walking around the house with the air of someone who had already won, too satisfied for someone who was merely looking after her mother-in-law's health. Grace hung up the phone with a lump in her throat, feeling that every passing minute was a minute less to stop something she didn't even know how to stop, now that she was on the outside.
It was nearly 10 o'clock at night, and she was already in bed trying to sleep without success when the phone rang. It was Martha, her voice low and hurried, almost whispering, as if she had slipped out to the back garden just to make the call. "Grace, you need to come now," she said, her voice trembling in a way Grace had never heard before. "The van arrives tomorrow morning, very early before breakfast, and I don't know what else to do."
Grace didn't think twice. She got out of bed, threw on the first clothes she found, and headed out into the night without her own car, without much money for a taxi. The street was empty, only the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the silence and the midnight chill cutting through her thin clothes. She walked to the nearest stop and waited nearly 40 minutes for the last night bus that passed near the estate, her heart racing the entire way, thinking of all the ways this could go wrong. On the way, she tried calling Richard. The first call went unanswered. The second went straight to voicemail. She knew he had probably seen her number on the screen and decided to ignore it, still annoyed by the conversation in the garage. But Grace did not give up. She called again and again, 7 times in a row, without stopping, until on the 8th attempt, almost at midnight, he finally answered, his voice heavy with sleep and irritation. "What do you want at this hour?" he asked coldly. "Mr. Harrington, I know you don't trust me right now, and I understand," Grace said with the firmest voice she could muster, despite her tight chest. "But I need you to listen to just one thing before you hang up. Tomorrow morning, very early, a van is coming to your house to take Eleanor to a clinic, without you there, without you truly knowing what is happening. If I'm wrong, you can hang up and never speak to me again. But if I'm right, you will have lost your last chance to stop it." On the other end of the line, silence, then a question more serious than the last. "What time does this van arrive?" Martha said it's before breakfast. More silence. On the other end of the line, Richard remembered, in spite of himself, the breakfast where he had seen his mother eating alone, content, and how Christine had dismissed his question too quickly for it to be a mere coincidence. "Stay where you are, Biol," he said. "I'm on my way." He hung up without saying goodbye.
And Grace stared at the phone in her hand, not knowing if it was relief or even more fear, because now it no longer depended on her. It depended on how long the road would take, how much sleep Richard still had in his eyes driving in the dead of night, and so many things she could no longer control.
Richard hung up in the early hours of the morning, cancelled his morning meeting, which was the entire reason for his trip, and took the road back in the pitch black, driving faster than he should, with an unsettling feeling growing inside him that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the van, it was about suddenly realizing that perhaps he had spent months believing the wrong version of the story without ever checking for himself. Grace arrived at the manor house shortly after 5 in the morning, while it was still dark, and found Martha waiting at the back gate, deep, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. The two entered the kitchen together without making a sound, and waited, the wall clock seeming to move slower than ever. Time passed far too slowly. Martha made tea that no one drank, just to have something to do with her hands. Grace stood near the window, looking out at the gravel driveway, counting the minutes, trying not to think of all the ways this could still go wrong. Richard could be delayed, could change his mind halfway, or could arrive too late.
At 6:30, the sound of an engine appeared down the driveway. The clinic van stopped in front of the main entrance and the driver got out, checking a paper in his hand, confirming the address. Christine was already up, dressed and waiting on the veranda, as if this were just another chore of the day.
It was at that exact moment that another car appeared around the bend, coming fast, hooting for the van to stop. Richard got out before his car had even come to a full stop, his face weary from the road, his eyes going straight to the van, then to his wife standing on the veranda, then to Grace and Martha, who had appeared at the kitchen door, unsure whether they should hide or stay. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, his hair messy, his eyes red from sleep, deprivation, and the drive. He hadn't even switched off his car engine properly when he got out and walked into the middle of the courtyard.
"Send that van away,"
Richard said, his voice not shouting, but with a firmness no one there had ever heard from him, his eyes fixed on his wife standing on the veranda. Christine hurried down the steps of the veranda, trying to control the situation before it slipped away entirely. "Richard, you don't understand. It's for her own good. Dr. Harrison signed off. It's all within the law." "I didn't ask if it's within the law," Richard cut her off. "I asked if it's within the truth." He turned to the van driver, who already looked uncomfortable in the middle of it all. "You can go. There won't be any transfer today." The man, relieved not to have to argue with anyone, got back into the vehicle without asking any more questions and drove away, the gravel dust rising behind him and settling slowly in the morning air. Christine stood still, not knowing what else to say, feeling the control she had built so carefully collapse in a single minute. "I want to know right now what is going on in this house," Richard said, looking at everyone there, his wife, the housekeeper, and the cook he had dismissed the day before. "And I want the whole truth, not the version I've heard up to now." It was Martha who, without waiting to be invited, took a step forward and said the sentence that began to unlock everything. "Richard, your mother has gone back to how she was before, ever since Grace stopped coming. That is no coincidence." Nah, Martha's words fell over the courtyard like a bucket of cold water. Richard looked at the housekeeper, then at Grace standing near the kitchen door, still unsure whether she should stay or leave. Something inside him began to click. The times he had seen his mother quieter, the nutritionist's reports he had never checked personally, Christine's haste to decide everything alone while he was away. "I want to see my mother," he said, starting to walk toward the house. It was Grace who spoke up, with the calmest voice she could manage after a sleepless night, to ask one last thing before any explanation. Mr. Harrington, give me 20 minutes in the kitchen, let me prepare her breakfast the right way, and then you can draw your own conclusions, seeing it with your own eyes. He hesitated, looked at Christine, who was still trying to argue something about medical protocol, and then nodded, too tired to argue once more about who was right without seeing clearly first. 20 minutes later, Grace carried the tray to the dining room, where Richard had already brought his mother. Seated at the table for the first time in weeks, it was the same potato and cabbage mash from the first day, prepared without a single unnecessary word. She served the dish slowly, looking only at Eleanor, at no one else. The elderly lady carried the spoon to her mouth, and her eyes shone in the exact same way they had on that first night, months ago.
When she finished her first spoonful, she looked at her son sitting beside her and spoke with the firmest voice she could manage. "It's been over a year, my son, since I started eating alone, early, before anyone else wakes up. My friends stopped visiting me, and I couldn't understand why. They replaced my cheerful caregiver, who laughed with me, with one who only looks at blood pressure and medicine." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I wasn't sick, Richard. I was lonely."
And it was this young woman here, she pointed to Grace with a trembling hand, who was the only one in all this time who sat by my side and treated me like a human being. Richard turned to his wife, his face losing its color. "Is this true?" "I only wanted to protect your mother," Christine began, her voice trembling for the first time since Grace had known her. "She would get too tired with so many visits, so much commotion. I only wanted her to rest." "Resting alone early every single day for over a year?" Richard asked, his voice low but sharp. "That is not care, Christine. That is something else, and I think you know it." Christine opened her mouth to deny it again, but it was Martha who stepped forward, finally letting out everything she had bottled up out of fear for over a year. She recounted, one by one, the visits cancelled with excuses of tiredness, the phone calls from Violet that were never passed on, the change of caregiver, and the schedules slowly shifting until no one noticed the difference anymore. With every detail Martha spoke, Christine tried to interrupt, but she couldn't, because each detail fit perfectly with things Richard, now paying attention, remembered seeing in passing and never questioning. Eleanor, still with the spoon in her hand, added softly without raising her voice, "I asked more than once why Violet had stopped coming. You always had an excuse ready. I thought it was just my mind." There were no papers, no documents, no courtroom evidence, just two different voices, a 90-year-old lady and a housekeeper of 27 years, each telling their part of the same truth. And in the face of this, Christine could neither deny nor explain. Richard did not shout. He sat in silence for a long moment, processing the scale of what he had allowed to happen by trusting too much and checking too little. Then he sat beside his mother, held her hand, and said softly that he was so sorry for not noticing sooner. It was enough for Eleanor to let flow the tears she had held back for months. Christine was not thrown out with shouting. She didn't need to be. In that silence, looking at her husband's face, she realized she had lost the very thing she had tried to control all this time, the trust of her own family. For the first time, Richard looked at her as if he no longer recognized the woman with whom he had built that home. She herself asked for some time away at her family's home in London, trying to understand how her fear of not being enough had turned into all of this.
When she returned weeks later, her relationship with Richard was never the same. He began checking things with his own eyes, and she lost the authority to decide alone what happened inside that house.
Martha, who had kept the secret out of fear of losing her job, received something from Richard she had never had in 27 years in the house. Praise spoken aloud in front of everyone for being the only one besides Grace who never stopped treating Eleanor like a human being. The nutritionist was dismissed the following week with a polite letter and a handsome payout. Richard made it clear in that single conversation that the issue had never been about the menu. Richard sought out Grace the following week, not to offer a formal apology, but to make an invitation different from what she expected. It was not to return as a cook, hidden away in the kitchen. It was to become part of the household's routine, sitting at the table as someone the family had learned to truly value. Eleanor never ate alone again. Every day, at the same time, she had company. Martha, sometimes even Richard, who began coming home earlier from work, just so he wouldn't miss dinner with his mother. Grace, who had never had the chance to sit at her own grandmother's table in life, found in that chair beside Eleanor the closure she had carried for years, proof that caring for someone to the very end with time, patience, and presence is worth more than anything money can buy. Sometimes,
Person's greatest hunger is not for food, but for company, respect, and someone willing to sit beside them for a few minutes. Eleanor started eating again because someone saw what everyone else was ignoring, and the greatest proof of care was not the dish served, but the courage to return her to a place she should never have lost, the family table.
now I want to know your opinion. Which moment of this story touched you the most? Share it here in the comments because I make sure to read every single message. And if you enjoy stories showing that kindness and courage can still change lives, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. See you in the next video.